This is the Vanguard Podcast. I'm Gavin.
And I'm Zac.
And today we're so pleased to welcome to the show a member of Virginia House of Delegates, Lee Carter, recently announced candidate for governor of Virginia. How's it going today, Lee?
Pretty good. Thank you so much for having me on. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, we're really stoked to talk to you today. Appreciate your time.
We're really excited to talk to you, Lee. And I was just so excited to see your announcement that you dropped the other day. If anyone's listening that may not be familiar, Lee has been a very outspoken member of the Virginia House of Delegates, an outspoken socialist. You were endorsed by the DSA when you won back in 2017 and defeated a Republican incumbent. And you're pretty much one of the most outspoken, if not the most outspoken elected socialists in the United States. I would say it's really cool to have you down there in Virginia, really repping those values and, legislating as such. And as you've declared your candidacy for governor, do you really see your campaign leaning into those values to define yourself to the people of Virginia? Or do you think you might have to downplay some of those socialist values to succeed electorally? Because, Virginia is clearly a pretty blue state at this point, I would think it's safe to say. But I have heard the state described as more of a Biden blue than a Bernie blue. So could you speak to that maybe a little bit and strategically what you're planning on?
Yeah. So the biggest thing to remember is that, I learned this very, very early on in my first campaign in 2017. I made the joke to my staff and a couple of my supporters, like, you got to lean in because if you're to the left of Barry Goldwater, they're going to call you Stalin. I didn't realize that would be literal. I mean, my opponent in 2017 sent a mailer to, as best as I can tell, around 11,000 homes that had sort of, the Mount Rushmore of communism, right? Marx, Lenin, Engels, Stalin, Mao, Carter. And it was talking about my healthcare policy because, if there's one thing that people remember Stalin for, it's health insurance, right? Makes sense. But I, that solidified that early notion that I had that it doesn't matter if you run away from what you believe or not, like they're gonna call you what they're gonna call you. The Republican Party called Joe Biden, a radical socialist. They called Barack Obama a radical socialist. They called the Clintons communists and said, they have the Communist News Network, CNN, on their side, right? Like this is for decades and decades and decades. The Republican Party's entire MO has been to just red bait as if it's still the Cold War. And that doesn't work anymore. And so, instead of trying to run away from any of the attacks that they're gonna send after me, and those attacks are gonna come regardless of what I do, I just go ahead and I lean in, right? Whenever they make these attacks, I mock them. I say, what is this, 1984? Like, are we filming a remake of Red Dawn? Like, come on, guys. And I just talk about the actual issues. I talk about the kind of economy that I want to see in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is an economy that is owned and operated by the people of Virginia, specifically the people that do the work, not outside investors. Because when you have your economic engines that are owned and operated by the people who work there, there's a lot of things that are just never going to happen, right? Offshoring is never going to happen because the people who would have to vote to do the offshoring are never going to vote to fire themselves, right? There's a lot of things that conventional businesses consider externalities, like environmental consequences of what they do, that all of a sudden become integral to the decision-making process because, polluting the air, polluting the water is not something that you can just, put the cleanup cost on the government anymore. When the workers are the ones making the decisions, they're not going to vote to pollute the air that their children breathe. They're not going to vote to give their own kids cancer to save 5%. It's not going to happen, right? So it's all about fundamentally restructuring the balance of power within the workplace and making sure that people who work day in and day out are also the ones making decisions in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that point that you make is so important, right? And I think it's a mistake, frankly, that a lot of, progressive left socialist candidates, broadly make, right? They placate these arguments that are just frankly absurd, right? You said, if you're running to the left of Barry Goldwater, they're going to, call you a communist. And I think that's really apt. And I'm wondering, when you bring these ideas to regular working people, as I'm sure you've done countless times throughout your career as a politician, what is the reaction to that? How do they react to restructuring these things? When you say we need to completely restructure that, I imagine there's a lot of apathy, a lot of people who believe that, we can't restructure these things. How do you convince them that we can?
I mean, everybody who works for someone else for a living has this feeling in the back of their mind like they're getting ripped off, because they are, right? If you go to work and you get paid $20 an hour by the company, it's because the work that you're doing for the company is worth at least 21, right? But more likely, probably $200 or $300, right? So there's this disconnect in the back of everybody's mind between what I actually do with my hands and what I see in my paycheck. And so, when you start talking about these issues, people really feel it, right? Whether they're on board with the analysis or not, it taps into this sort of emotional, kind of like lizard brain kind of response where it's like, yeah, I have been getting ripped off. And that was even a part of my journey to these political positions. I didn't start off as a socialist. It was a very long journey. But the first step on it was actually at work, like way before I decided to run for office. I was fixing cancer therapy equipment, and I was making what I thought was good money. I was getting paid, I think it was $35 an hour. And I was like, man, this is the most money I've ever made, maybe the most money I'm ever going to make. This is great. And then I saw an invoice that one of my customers had left out in the control room from my machine. And I realized the company was charging like $400 an hour for me to be there. I went, oh my God. And I didn't think about it for a while after that, but it sort of built this sort of kernel of dissatisfaction that just kind of grew and grew and grew, because it was that moment that I realized I'm being ripped off every single minute, every single day that I'm at work. I'm being ripped off because I'm not the one that makes decisions in the company.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting story. And I think that a lot of people, just having experiences in the workforce is that radicalizing, thing that happens for them, because it is so obviously unfair, increasingly obvious in that. So, very interesting story. Another area where you're, unique from other Democrats, I would say, is your embrace of gun rights. And despite the fact that, most gun regulations that are commonly proposed by Democratic lawmakers, like, banning of bump stocks or ending the gun show loopholes, I would consider to be pretty common sense, pretty moderate. That being said, do you think that the Democratic Party has been mistaken in branding themselves as the anti-gun party, especially in a state like Virginia?
Yeah, I really do. Obviously I did 5 years in the Marine Corps. Like, if there's one thing that Marines know, it's firearms. Yeah. The government makes sure of that. I think the Democratic Party has seen a major focus of its efforts on disarmament, which, from an institutional perspective within the Democratic Party, it makes sense for them because there's a lot of big money donors who are very interested in funding anti-gun campaigns. But for the people, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And electorally, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because, when you look at our history, through the history of this country, there are periods of low risk for political violence and periods of high risk for political violence. And I think right now we're in one of those high risk periods. Certainly we've seen it with the Nazi attack on Charlottesville in 2017, which happened here in Virginia. We've seen it with the Proud Boys attacking DC and Portland and Seattle and cities across the country. And you've got these groups that go around, and then there's just this mass street violence coming from the extreme right that targets it targets a couple of individuals that have drawn their ire, but usually what ends up happening is they gather around where they think that individual will be, and then they scatter out and they spread that violence amongst the population, right? So they attack targets of opportunity. And we've seen infiltration by the extreme right in the police. over the decades. The FBI has even warned about how many Nazis there are in local police forces. We've seen, hell, on Christmas Day, there was, the sheriff's department, whose headquarters is less than a mile away from where I'm sitting right now, had, someone uncovered in their ranks that was posting on Parler about how they wanted to assassinate local politicians. Like, this is a very
that's
serious
Rage Against
problem.
the Machine 101, man. Some of those who work forces are the same that burn crosses.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not naive enough to think that law enforcement alone will be able to solve this problem and keep people safe, because that Venn diagram is not two separate circles. As much as I wish it would be, it's not, and it probably never will be. And so, my line in the sand is, there are some measures that keep people safer, like background checks and getting rid of bump stocks. But overall, I am never going to do anything that binds the ability of vulnerable people and vulnerable communities to enact self-defense and community defense, right? When the Nazis come to town to beat people, they should see an armed response from the people. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it's real, because that's the only way we're going to be able to keep people safe, is if the people are keeping the people safe. And you can't do that with thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, I think that's really fair, especially with what we've seen over the summer. Some of the, all black militias that we saw take to the streets in response to the, killing of George Floyd and the murder of, Breonna Taylor and so many others. I think it was a necessary show of force from those communities that, they're not just going to keep taking that abuse, be it from the police or, from racist, Nazis that are members of their own community potentially. So I do think that's a good point and a good way to look at it. One other thing I'm interested that you briefly touched on there is you said that there might be, groups funding the disarmament. Obviously, we often hear about the NRA as being a corrupting influence within DC, on the other side of the aisle, responsible for lack of action on gun control. But I'm interested to hear a little bit more on what you referenced there, where there might be groups or organizations that are actually interested in, the disarmament of the population.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got the pro-gun billionaires, the Koch brothers, your Sheldon Adelsons of the world, your NRA donors that want no regulations whatsoever. And then on the Democratic side, you've got your anti-gun billionaires, like your Michael Bloombergs, who want no guns whatsoever. And the reality is that, we have to be somewhere in between. There has to be some regulation to make sure that, because there are some people who cannot be trusted with a firearm, but not many. But you also can't take all the guns away, right? Because then that leaves people vulnerable to mob violence from the extreme right. And so, my position that people who Nazis want to kill should be able to stop Nazis from killing them is a position that is common sense, that is supported by the overwhelming majority of the public. But it's,
I also think it's a necessary,
every other politician in America.
Yeah, and I think it's a necessary,
because it threatens
unspoken part of
the other.
Criminal justice reform, right? If we're going to have defunding the police, if the police are going to be an element of, if we're going to, reduce the police presence in our community, right? You're going to be communities are going to have to, as in a sense, be responsible for policing themselves, which I think provides a lot of benefits that people have talked about. But they're going to have the resources and the tools to do that. And I don't know why people are so much more comfortable giving those tools to, like, the police, essentially just mob rule gang, with, a monopoly on violence, whereas essentially you're just democratizing access to weapons of self-defense, which is something that I think Gavin and I would both agree that we're here for. One of the things that I would like to just inquire about with you is something Gavin and I were talking about before the show. As two leftists, as two guys who have never been particularly interested in firearms, I find myself, relatively uninformed on the issue. I can see when I look outside that there's clearly an epidemic of gun violence. We see in America so much more devastation in that capacity, whether it occurs in mass shootings or whether it occurs on the streets of places like our own hometown of Kansas City, which has one of the highest rates of gun violence deaths per capita. I'm wondering, how do we solve that? And to what component is, things like mental health and providing resources and community access to resources part of solving that problem, as opposed to just limiting access to guns?
Well, first of all, I'd like to stipulate that people who are struggling with mental health issues are far more likely to be victims of gun violence than perpetrators. And so, there's this standard right-wing deflection where anytime you bring up violence, they start talking about mental health as a cure for that. But it's not going to be, because you're sort of blaming the victims for what happened to them, and that's something that I'm never going to engage in. But the reality, when you look at the numbers about gun violence, the reality is that the overwhelming majority of gun violence incidents are with stolen handguns, right? But then what does the Democratic Party do? The Democratic Party tries to make it harder to legally buy a long arm. Why? The problem is here, and the Democrats' proposal is here, and they're two separate things. It just goes to show that the political class in this country really is only interested in using this issue as a wedge in elections. They drive on, the Republicans drive their turnout with fear that the Democrats are going to take your guns. And the Democrats drive their turnout with fear that, if the Republicans have their way, then your kid's going to get shot. And the reality is neither. The reality is that the overwhelming majority of people who have firearms are responsible gun owners. There is a problem with handguns in particular being stolen and then being used in crimes. But there have been very, very few policy proposals on the national stage that actually get at that problem.
Yeah, I think that's. Oh, sorry, Zach, were you going to say something?
Oh, well, I was just going to say that's sort of the modus operandi for the Democratic Party, right? False equivalencies, pivoting, pretending to take action on something while letting the crux of the problem continue to fester and grow. I don't want to pivot too hard, but I did want to ask you about another issue that has been noticed with the Democratic Party becoming just as much an enemy of left and, popular working class policy as the right. Patrick Wilson of the Richmond Post-Dispatch, who covered your campaign in depth in 2017, observed that people in the Democratic Party would have preferred that he not cover you at all, and frankly prefer that you lose, saying, quote, "The party, like the Republicans in Virginia, are so closely tied to the big monopoly that Carter stood against that they would have rather see you be defeated." Could you talk about your fight against big energy and your belief in antitrust laws and breaking up the big monopolies, and also just what it's like running against two parties at once?
Yeah, I mean, I really have been running against two parties at once for my entire time in the House. In my first term, I actually I voted against the multi-billion-dollar Amazon deal. I voted against a similarly corrupt deal to give $70 million to Micron, the semiconductor manufacturer, in my home district. I was intentionally excluded by both parties from all the negotiations around that because they knew that I would object. And then they ended up actually having a Republican from 6 hours away put in the bill to give $70 million to this company that wanted to expand their factory in my district. So, there's this bipartisan economic consensus around trickle-down economics. But we've seen, and we've been trying this for 50 years, and it's never worked. When someone comes in and talks about busting up monopolies, putting economic power in the hands of working people, when we talk about how economic development really should function to serve the people rather than serving corporate interests, it gets a backlash from both major parties. And so, my local Democratic committee was helpful, but the Democratic Party of Virginia as a whole sort of likes to pretend that I don't exist. They'll do kind of the bare minimum to say, oh yeah, we helped him. But, you look at the amount of money they spend in my race versus a neighboring district. And, they'll spend 4, 5, 6 times as much money in the neighboring district, even though that race is not as close. Yeah. And it's because, they have to keep up appearances that we're all on one team. But at the end of the day, their lives are going to be a lot easier when they're talking to their donors if I'm no longer a factor.
Well, that's funny that you have avoided, or they've been able to kind of just ignore you up until this point. But now that you're literally running for governor, they're going to have to confront.
They're going to have to give you the Upton Sinclair treatment.
Yeah, the Upton Sinclair treatment, exactly. And you've pledged to only accept small dollar donations in this race, which is super admirable and something that we wish that all politicians would pledge. However, that's not the case. And I'm guessing that your opponents in this race will not only not be following such principles when it comes to campaign finance, but I imagine that the Virginia Democratic Party, as you referenced, is probably already in the process of finding the perfect milquetoast candidate to prop up with big money, someone who's probably not a socialist. And I'm just wondering what your strategy is to overcome that, big money gap that you're going to be up against, and also how you're going to force the media to cover your candidacy, because often it seems like when it comes to successful leftist candidates, they really understand that ability to force the media coverage, to force the conversation in their direction, rather than just allowing themselves to be sidelined by the establishment.
Yeah. I've never taken a single dime from for-profit corporations or industry interest groups. I had a few, in my first campaign that tried, and I returned the checks with a very polite, thank you, but I only accept contributions from individuals. But Virginia has no limits whatsoever on campaign contributions, right? The only restriction is you have to be an American citizen, a green card holder, or a corporation from somewhere in America, right? Those are the only limits. And so, we had in 2019, there's a Republican who got a $500,000 check from a casino owner in Illinois, a single check for $500,000. And that was perfectly legal, completely fine. And that was for a House race. And there's 100 House seats in Virginia. So when we're talking about a statewide race, we're talking about Ralph Northam raised like $31 million, right?
For a state race?
Yeah, for a state race. And in this primary, I'm running against a multimillionaire who is very closely connected with the Clinton family and 3 lawyers. And so they're going to have a lot of big institutional money. And the only way that we overcome that is with thousands and thousands of people kicking in and helping out where they can. Because, there is a desire for a different kind of politics in every state. But we haven't been able to actually break through and reach people and convince them that there is a better way forward. And we have to.
Well, Lee, one of the things I really wanted to ask you about it is I feel like a lot of politicians sort of feign a handicap when in office, right? And we see that as justification for getting nothing done that actually benefits working people. Working people then, grow upset or apathetic towards politics. It's kind of this grand conspiracy going on where it's like they continuously make the government work against the people, fuck up, make their lives harder, that the people then vote against the government to solve their problems. I'm wondering, what can you accomplish if elected to serve the people as a governor of Virginia? What can you do that tangibly impacts their lives, sort of, with all of your executive power that office brings? How could you paint that picture for people so they know the importance of what can get done for them?
Well, for starters, I've learned a lot about the limits of legislative authority through my 4 years in the House of Delegates. So, I've seen that a lot of authority that you would think is vested in a legislature has been just sort of handed over to governors throughout the country. But, despite that, I've been able to do things that actually materially impact people's lives, right? So, airports in Virginia, they were paying wheelchair attendants below minimum wage by calling them tipped employees. But the Federal Air Carriers Act prevented them from asking for tips, right? So we had people who were working for $3, $4 an hour in our airports. And I put in a bill to make sure that they get paid the airport minimum wage, which is, I believe it's somewhere around $13 or $14 an hour. And that passed, right? So now those folks are actually getting paid close to a livable wage, right? It's higher than Virginia's minimum wage. I also introduced a bill to cap copays on insulin products to no more than $50 for a 1 month supply. right? So people who were rationing insulin, there were a lot of people who they're on Medicare, but they have a supplemental plan and they fall into what was called the donut hole, where, they were getting the Medicare rate up until about May or June. And then all of a sudden they had to pay, $600, $700, $800 for their insulin for June and July and August before their supplemental plan kicked in. Now it's $50 a month, right? So there are ways that I've already been able to help from the legislature, but there are also limits. I've not been able to get a vote on repealing the misnamed right to work law, right? I've not been able to get a vote on repealing the death penalty. I've been pushing for legalizing cannabis and using every single penny of that cannabis tax revenue for reparations for Black and Indigenous folks in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But from the legislature, it's very easy for the leadership to just sort of funnel that to a committee where it dies quietly. As governor, I'll have the full extent of executive authority. I'll have line item veto over $100 billion a year budget. There are a lot of ways where a governor can directly impact legislative priorities. The governor can send bills down to the legislature. The governor can call the legislature into a special session at any time to deal with whatever issue he or she wants, right? So governors have a ton of authority that an individual legislator doesn't. And so as governor, I'll be able to direct the state police to no longer harass protesters, right? I'll be able to use the National Guard to protect protesters from the police in the same way that, for example, the National Guard was called in Arkansas to integrate their public schools, right? The National Guard had to provide security from the public and the police so that Black students could get into the newly integrated schools, right? That's one thing that I'll be able to do as governor is actually protect people that are exercising their First Amendment right to protest. But the big thing is that line item veto authority over the budget.
Yeah.
So as governor, I will not send any new money to corporate handouts, period. It's not going to happen. That money is going to go to Virginians to start up our own democratically owned and operated enterprises. Also, the governor has the power of clemency. So even if I have to do it person by person, I will make sure that through my 4 years as governor, our jail and prison population is at least 30% lower when I leave after 4 years than when I'm sworn in. Even if I have to grant clemency person by person, that's going to happen.
Well, that's so. Gavin, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, you've already kind of, done the impossible, so to speak, in Virginia once with getting into the House of Delegates. So I just think this is a super exciting candidacy. I'm really excited to hear more about the noise you make in this race. And again, you're obviously up against some probably really big moneyed candidates that have the full institutional support from, the backing. So I'm really excited to see, how you're able to counter those more establishment voices and how you're able to put together a campaign that really does fight for and hopefully connect with the people of Virginia, because I think it would just be super exciting and great for the movement and for the state and its residents if you're able to win this race. To make sure that happens, Lee, I've obviously included the link for people to donate to your campaign in the description box. Is there anything else that people can do to help you get elected to governor of Virginia to help start making some of these changes that you've just elucidated for us?
Yeah, the biggest thing is getting the word out. We're going to rely on a lot of word of mouth. We're going to rely on people talking to their friends, talking to their neighbors, their coworkers, and saying, there's this guy, he's not running as many ads as everyone else, but this is the guy that's fighting for us, right? And he's not running as many ads because he's fighting for us, because he doesn't owe his political career to the power company. He doesn't owe his political career to such and such billionaire, right? And so it's going to come down to people spreading the message, word of mouth, talking to their friends, talking to their neighbors, talking to their coworkers, talking to their family, and saying, this election is on June 8th. You can vote by mail. You probably should vote by mail because we're in a pandemic. But it's a multimillionaire, 3 lawyers, and Lee.
It's a pretty obvious choice.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for people to be able to see what it's like to see a true working person, somebody who's really of the people in an executive branch position, to remind them what our government is capable of doing for its people, right? So for so long, the government has been focused on maximum extraction from the people to the benefit of the corporations, to the benefit of the opulent. And what people don't understand is that power could be wielded to uplift so many people. And Gavin and I are tremendously excited to watch your campaign, and hope that you can do that for the people of Virginia. So thank you so much for coming on the show today, Lee. It was a great pleasure speaking with you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.